One of the great ironies of history is that when Japan invaded China during World War II, many of the Chinese soldiers opposing them were trained by Japan's German allies. Today we're going to investigate the subject of Sino-German cooperation. First, I'll give a brief overview of Sino-German relations up to the First World War. For the vast majority of history, Germans had little to no idea of what was going on in China, and vice versa. Germany didn't exist as a unified country until 1871. It was a collection of smaller states before that, and there were some people from those states who had visited China starting in the later years of the Ming Dynasty. Prussia, the state that unified Germany in 1871, had contacted the Qing dynasty in 1751 and established official relations in 1861. In 1897, 2 German Catholic missionaries were killed in Shandong province. Germany retaliated by seizing the city of Qingdao. This city's name is commonly romanized as Tsingtao. You may have heard of this city from their famous beer, and the Qingdao Brewery was founded by Germans in 1903. Germany was also part of the Eight-Nation Alliance to defeat the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. In 1912, the Qing dynasty was overthrown and replaced by a republic. In 1914, World War I broke out. German possessions in China were easy pickings for Britain's ally Japan, and they lost Qingdao a few months into the war. China was originally neutral, but later declared war on Germany and the other Central Powers. China didn't send any soldiers to Europe, but they did send laborers. China during World War I is an interesting story, and I hope to cover it in more detail in the future. In 1918, Germany lost the war, and the German Empire was replaced by the Weimar Republic. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, and it was signed by all of the Allied powers, except for China. There was a reason for this. China had hoped that Germany's Chinese possessions would be returned to China, but instead they were given to Japan. Japan's reputation in China decreased, while Germany's reputation increased. Diplomatic relations were re-established with the Sino-German Treaty of 1921. This treaty was notable in that it was an equal treaty instead of an unequal treaty. This meant that German citizens in China would be subject to Chinese and not German laws. While Germany had lost the war, the Imperial German Army was still highly regarded. Germany was limited to an army of 100,000 men, meaning that a lot of veterans were now out of jobs. China had no restrictions on its armed forces and was able to field a large army, but it needed people to train the army into an elite, modern fighting force. And when the alliance between the Kuomintang and the Communists broke down, the KMT dismissed its Soviet advisors. So China was the perfect place for German generals without a job to come to in the 20s and 30s. General Max Bauer was involved in an attempted coup called the Kapp Putsch in 1920, making him a persona non grata in Germany. In 1926, he came to China, and he would serve as an advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. The two men got along well, as Bauer was quick to adapt to the situation in China, something that wasn't true of some German generals who came later. Bauer suggested that the Chinese army should be reduced in size and that China should focus on quality over quantity. China began training a German-inspired elite unit. He encouraged Chiang to incorporate air power into the Chinese military. He participated in the Central Plains War, which pitted Chiang Kai-shek's National Revolutionary Army and allied warlords against their former allies, the Kuomintang, and their allied warlords. While China benefited from German military expertise, Germany benefited from China's natural resources, particularly tungsten and antimony. Bauer understood the importance of not only improving China's military, but also its industrial capacity. He was able to set up contacts with German industrialists, and he stressed the importance of railroads to Chiang Kai-shek. In order to fight a modern war, China needed modern industry. As he said to a Chinese journalist in 1927, "You cannot have a general staff until you have a modern army, and China has no modern army. You cannot organize and use a general staff until you have the industries to support an army." Bauer died in China in 1929, while the Central Plains War was still ongoing, and he was replaced by Hermann Kriebel. Kriebel was seen by Chiang Kai-shek and by modern historians as a downgrade from Max Bauer. Chiang didn't follow Kriebel's advice, and Kriebel was out after a year. But he would return to China as a diplomat after his friend Adolf Hitler came to power back home. The next leader of the German military mission to China was Georg Wetzel. Wetzel was a good tactician, but he didn't have Bauer's understanding of the importance of industry to modern war. The Central Plains War would soon end in a success for Chiang Kai-shek, and he now had control over northern China. Just like with Kriebel, Wetzel was no Max Bauer, and Chiang often ignored Wetzel's advice. German trained divisions saw action in Shanghai in 1932, when a battle ensued with Japan after an anti-Japanese riot in the city, and they performed well in the battle. However, it would still be another 5 years before full-out war between China and Japan would begin. In 1933, while Wetzel was still in China, the Weimar Republic was replaced by the Third Reich as Hitler rose to power. One interesting thing about Wetzel is that even though he died after World War II, he didn't have any position of command during the war. The next year, Georg Wetzel was replaced by Hans von Zicht. Von Zicht was likely sent to China because he was opposed to the subordination of the German army to the Nazi Party. At the same time, a lot of Jewish German veterans began to come to China. Chiang's patience with the Germans was beginning to wear thin, and von Zicht made him regain his trust in Germany. You might think that since Germany is now Nazi Germany, that they'd be allies with Japan, but that wasn't the case yet. In the early days of the Third Reich, there were pro-China and pro-Japan factions within Germany. Hitler even had some positive things to say about China and the Chinese people. Von Zicht encouraged Chiang Kai-shek to build rings of forts around communist positions to prevent them from escaping, as they had often done in the past. And this strategy saw success. Hans von Zicht was only in China for a year, though. He left the country in 1935 and died in Germany in 1936. The final leader of the German military mission was Alexander von Falkenhausen. This was a man who had a great interest in Chinese history and culture and was a great fit for the job. He thought highly of Chiang Kai-shek. The two spoke to each other in Japanese, as both of them had spent time in Japan. Like Max Bauer, he understood the importance of industry and negotiated contracts for German companies to operate in China. Von Falkenhausen helped reorganize the Chinese army and train it so it was prepared to face Japan. He understood that China was not yet in a position to fight Japan, and that it would take some time for China to be ready. Meanwhile, Chinese soldiers began to wear the German Stahlhelm and do the goose step. Finally, in 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War began as Chinese troops were attacked by the Japanese in Beijing. Von Falkenhausen would take part in the early phases of the war, leading troops at the Battle of Shanghai. He had helped Chiang prepare for this moment, and he believed that China could win the war. He understood that China had time on its side and that Japan would lose in a war of attrition. While Japan was gaining ground, China would stand firm. Chiang Kai-shek would follow von Falkenhausen's advice, mostly playing defense. At the beginning of the war, Chiang had under his command 20 divisions that had received at least some level of German military training. These would prove very useful in the coming fight with Japan. In addition to German training, German weapons were widespread in the Chinese army, particularly those produced by Mauser. These included the Mauser C-96, Mauser 1914, the Gewehr 98, and perhaps most famously, the Mauser Standard model, which was copied in China and became known as the Chiang Kai-shek rifle. China received a shipment of panzers 1 month before the Japanese invasion began. German artillery and anti-air guns were also imported. Chinese soldiers also used German-style stick grenades. German aircraft, including the Heinkel HE-111, saw service in the Chinese Nationalist Air Force. It's important to note that Germany did not immediately withdraw its advisors with the outbreak of war in 1937. Shortly before war broke out with Japan, Chinese Finance Minister H. Kung visited Germany, where he met with several Nazi officials, including Hermann Goering and Adolf Hitler. He was told that Germany would not support Japan in its war of aggression against China. Germany tried to mediate a peace agreement between the two countries, which obviously failed. All the while, German generals continued to train Chinese soldiers, and Chiang Kai-shek sent his son, Wei-kuo, to Germany to serve in the Wehrmacht. He would participate in the Anschluss of Austria. But as you know, Germany would eventually go all in for Japan. On May 12, 1938, Germany extended diplomatic recognition to Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state in northeastern China. The next day, Germany's new pro-Japanese foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop ordered German advisors in China to return home. This is the same von Ribbentrop of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact fame. Germany was officially for Japan and against China. But diplomatic relations were not cut off yet. China wouldn't declare war on Germany until 1941. In fact, China didn't even declare war on Japan until 1941. For the first 4 years, it was an undeclared war, and there are different theories behind why that was the case. Chiang Wei-kuo stayed in Germany up until right before the invasion of Poland, when he was sent to the United States where he trained at Fort Knox. I should also point out that it wasn't just the nationalists who had German military advisors. The communists had Otto Braun, but he was working for the Soviet Union, not Germany. He was considered a very bad advisor, though. On July 2nd, 1941, Germany would recognize the puppet regime of Wang Jingwei as the official government of China. The Wang Jingwei regime was basically the Vichy France of the East, except even more pathetic. Italy and Spain decided to switch diplomatic recognition from Chiang's government to Wang's government on the same day. Just as in the First World War, Chinese troops did not see action against Germany despite the declaration of war. China could not spare any troops in Europe as it was fighting for its very survival against Japan. Nevertheless, China played an important role in overall Allied victory. Had China not tied down over 1 million Japanese soldiers, the United States would have likely needed to send more soldiers to Japan instead of Germany, which would have prolonged the war. After the war, both China and Germany would find themselves divided. Germany was divided into military occupation zones where it would be governed by the American, Soviet, British, and French militaries. In China, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists reopened soon after the end of the war with Japan. Germany had no control over its foreign policy for the next 4 years. By the time the West German government was established in 1949, the Chinese capital of Nanjing had already fallen to the communists. West Germany would have unofficial relations with the Republic of China, which continue until today. In 1972, it decided to recognize the People's Republic of China. East Germany was unsurprisingly one of the first countries to recognize the PRC. So what happened to the major figures of Sino-German cooperation? Chiang Kai-shek led the Republic of China until his death in 1975, spending the last quarter century of his life in Taiwan. His adopted son, Chiang Wei-kuo, who had served in the Wehrmacht, served in the armed forces of the Republic of China for decades. He died in 1997. Of the 5 generals who led the German military mission to China, 2 of them died before World War II began. Those were Max Bauer and Hans von Zeigt. Hermann Kriebel became the German consul in Shanghai after Hitler's rise to power. Eventually, he returned to Germany. He died in 1941, and his funeral was attended by Hitler as well as Hermann Goering and Rudolf Hess. Georg Wetzel and Alexander von Falkenhausen both survived the war. During the war, Wetzel worked as a newspaper editor. He died in 1947. Alexander von Falkenhausen was a general in the Wehrmacht during the war. He served as the military governor of Belgium. While he did not want to persecute Jews, he eventually gave in to demands for their deportation. However, he also saved the lives of many Belgian Jews. He was implicated in an attempt on Hitler's life in 1944 and spent the rest of the war in concentration camps. He was arrested again after Allied victory, but was eventually released. His release was due to the testimony of a Chinese-Belgian woman named Chen Xiuling, who testified of von Falkenhausen's efforts to save Jews. Von Falkenhausen would continue to follow the news from China for the rest of his life. In 1958, he received the Order of the Sacred Tripod Award from the Republic of China government, and it was delivered to him by the Republic of China's ambassador to Belgium. He died in 1966. If you enjoyed this video, check out some of my other content where I talk about China during World War II and its leader, Chiang Kai-shek.